The courtroom smelled like disinfectant and old wood. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the worn benches. At the defendant's table sat a man who looked like he'd been carved from stone and left out in the rain too long. His name was Marcus Sterling, though the arrest report listed him simply as John Doe until they'd run his prints. 63 years old, no fixed address. Charged with loitering and trespassing after being found asleep on a park bench for the third time in 2 months. He wore donated clothes from the county lockup, a grey sweatshirt 2 sizes too big, and jeans that hung loose on his frame. His hair, more silver than black now, was cut military short, though it had been weeks since he'd seen a barber. His hands rested flat on the table, calloused and scarred, fingers that had once held rifles now trembling slightly from withdrawal or exhaustion, or both. Judge Eleanor Brooks sat behind the bench, her black robe crisp and severe. She was 47, with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun and reading glasses perched on her nose. She'd been on the bench for 9 years, and in that time she'd seen every variation of human failure parade through her courtroom. Addicts, thieves, violent offenders, and homeless veterans like the man before her now. Men who'd given everything to their country and received nothing in return except a one-way ticket to the streets. She was tired, bone-tired. It was Friday afternoon, the end of a brutal week that had included 2 murder trials and a child abuse case that had kept her awake for 3 nights straight. She had 27 cases left on her docket, and Marcus Sterling was just another number, another file, another problem she didn't have time to solve. The prosecutor, a young woman fresh out of law school with too much ambition and not enough compassion, stood and recited the charges in a voice that suggested she was reading a grocery list. Your Honor, the defendant has been arrested 3 times in the past 60 days for violating Municipal Code 647WE, lodging in a public place without permission. He has failed to appear for 2 previous court dates and has demonstrated a pattern of disregard for the law. The people request the maximum sentence of 90 days in county jail. Judge Brooks didn't look up from the file. She'd already made her decision. 90 days. Maybe it would be enough time for him to get clean, get sober, get whatever help the system pretended to offer. Maybe not. Either way, he'd be off the streets. And that was what the city council wanted. That was what the neighborhood associations demanded. Clean up the parks. Remove the eyesores. Make the problem invisible. Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice flat and administrative. Do you have anything to say before I impose sentence? Marcus didn't move. His eyes were fixed on a spot somewhere in the middle distance, as if he were looking through the walls of the courtroom and into some other time, some other place. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, like gravel being dragged across concrete. No, ma'am. That was it. 2 words, no excuses, no pleas for mercy. No sob story about PTSD or addiction or the failures of the VA system. Just 2 words that carried the weight of a man who'd stopped expecting anything from the world a long time ago. Judge Brooks felt something twist in her chest. Irritation, maybe, or pity, but she pushed it down. She'd learned not to let emotion cloud her judgment. The law was the law. The sentence was clear. She opened her mouth to speak, and that's when the bailiff moved. His name was Raymond Ortiz, and he was 71 years old. He'd been a bailiff in this courthouse for 23 years, ever since he'd retired from the army after 30 years of service. He was a quiet man, the kind who blended into the background, who did his job without complaint, and went home to his small apartment where he lived alone with his memories and his regrets. But now he was moving toward the bench with a purpose that made the prosecutor glance up in surprise. He held a piece of paper in his hand, a yellow sticky note he'd pulled from the pad on his desk. He'd written something on it in black ink, his handwriting shaky but legible. Judge Brooks looked up, annoyed at the interruption. "Bailiff?" Raymond didn't speak. He just climbed the 2 steps to the bench and placed the note in front of her, his hand trembling as he did. Then he stepped back, his eyes locked on Marcus Sterling with an expression that might have been reverence or grief, or something in between. Judge Brooks glanced down at the note. Her eyes scanned the words once, quickly, then again, slower. Her face went pale. Her hand came up to cover her mouth. The courtroom was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic outside. She read the note a 3rd time. "He carried your father's body through 3 miles of jungle for 3 days to bring him home. I was there. I saw it. This man is a hero." The paper slipped from her fingers and fluttered to the desk. Judge Brooks stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. The prosecutor looked up, confused. The court reporter's hands froze over the keys. Marcus Sterling didn't move, didn't react, didn't seem to notice that the entire room had shifted on its axis. "Recess," Judge Brooks said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're in recess." She stepped down from the bench, her robe billowing behind her, and walked directly to the defendant's table. Marcus finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. They were grey, those eyes, the colour of storm clouds, and they held a depth of pain that made her want to look away. But she didn't. "Sergeant Sterling," she said quietly, "is it true? Were you in Vietnam? Were you with the 173rd Airborne?" For a long moment he didn't answer. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Yes, Mum." "And did you know a soldier named Captain James Brooks?" The name hung in the air between them like a ghost. Marcus's jaw tightened. His hands, which had been resting flat on the table, curled into fists. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with something that might have been grief, or guilt, or both. "I knew him." Judge Brooks felt her knees go weak. She reached out and gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. "He was my father." Marcus closed his eyes. A single tear tracked down his weathered cheek, cutting a path through the dirt and stubble. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." The courtroom erupted in confused murmurs. The prosecutor stood, objecting to something she didn't understand. The court reporter abandoned her machine and leaned forward, trying to hear, but Judge Brooks didn't care about any of it. She was staring at the man in front of her, the man she'd been about to send to jail, and seeing him for the first time, not as a criminal, not as a statistic, not as a problem to be solved, but as the man who'd brought her father home. Her mother had told her the story 100 times. How Captain James Brooks had been killed in an ambush in the Central Highlands in 1971. How his body had been recovered by his men and brought back to base, even though it would have been easier, safer to leave him behind. How one soldier in particular, she'd never known his name, had refused to let the captain's body be left in the jungle. How he'd carried it for miles through enemy territory, through monsoon rains and sniper fire, until they reached the extraction point. "He was your angel," her mother used to say, her voice soft with gratitude and sorrow. "He brought your father home so we could bury him, so we could say goodbye." Judge Brooks had been 5 years old when her father died. She barely remembered him, just fragments really. The smell of his aftershave, the sound of his laugh, the way he used to lift her onto his shoulders and carry her around the backyard, pretending she was flying. But she remembered the funeral. She remembered the flag-draped coffin. She remembered her mother's tears. And she remembered the story of the soldier who'd made it all possible. The soldier who was now sitting in front of her, homeless and broken, and about to be sent to jail. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Why didn't you tell anyone who you were?" Marcus opened his eyes and looked at her with an expression of such profound weariness that it took her breath away. "Because it doesn't matter," he said simply. "What I did then doesn't change what I am now." "That's not true." "It is." His voice was firm now, almost angry. "I'm nobody, Your Honor. I'm a drunk. I'm a failure. I couldn't hold a job, couldn't keep a family, couldn't stay sober. The man who carried your father out of that jungle died a long time ago. I'm just what's left." Judge Brooks shook her head, tears streaming down her face now, not caring who saw. "You're wrong," she said fiercely. "You're wrong." She turned to the bailiff, who was still standing at attention near the bench, his own eyes wet. "Raymond, you were there? You saw it?" Raymond nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I was a corporal in the same unit. We were pinned down for 2 days. The captain was hit in the first hour. Sergeant Sterling. He wouldn't leave him. We all said it was suicide, that we'd never make it out alive if we tried to carry a body. But he wouldn't listen. He put the captain on his back and he walked 3 miles through hell. I've never seen anything like it before or since." Judge Brooks turned back to Marcus. "You saved my father's body. You brought him home. Do you have any idea what that meant to my mother? To me? We got to say goodbye because of you. We got closure because of you." Marcus looked down at his hands. "I was just doing my job." "No." Judge Brooks's voice was sharp now, cutting through the emotion. "You were doing more than your job. You were honoring a promise. You were showing the kind of courage and loyalty that most people can't even imagine. And I will not let you sit here and tell me that doesn't matter." She straightened, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, and turned to the prosecutor. "The charges are dismissed, all of them. This case is closed." The prosecutor's mouth fell open. "Your Honor, you can't. I can, and I am. This man is a decorated veteran who served his country with honor. He deserves better than to be treated like a criminal for the crime of having nowhere to sleep. Case dismissed." She slammed the gavel down with a finality that echoed through the courtroom. Then she turned back to Marcus, who was staring at her in disbelief. "Sergeant Sterling, I need you to come with me." "Ma'am, please, just trust me." Marcus stood slowly, his legs unsteady. Raymond moved to his side, offering a hand, and Marcus took it. The 2 old soldiers stood together for a moment, and something passed between them. Recognition, respect, the unspoken bond of men who'd seen the worst of humanity and survived. Judge Brooks led them out of the courtroom, ignoring the protests of the prosecutor and the confused whispers of the spectators. She walked through the hallways of the courthouse, her robe billowing behind her, until she reached her chambers. She unlocked the door and gestured for Marcus to sit. He did, sinking into the leather chair across from her desk like a man who'd been walking for 1,000 years and had finally been given permission to rest. Judge Brooks sat down across from him and folded her hands on the desk. "My mother is still alive," she said quietly. "She's 89 years old and she lives in a guest house on my property. She talks about you all the time. She calls you her angel. She spent 50 years praying for you, hoping that whoever you were, wherever you were happy and safe and loved." Marcus's face crumpled. He put his head in his hands and his shoulders shook with silent sobs. Judge Brooks reached across the desk and placed her hand over his. "You're coming home with me," she said firmly. "Tonight. I have a guest house. It's small, but it's clean and warm, and it's yours for as long as you need it. No arguments, no protests. You brought my father home. Now I'm bringing you home." Marcus looked up at her, his face wet with tears. "I don't deserve this." "Yes, you do. You deserve so much more than this. But it's a start." For the first time in longer than he could remember, Marcus Sterling felt something other than despair. It was small, fragile, barely there, but it was hope, and it was enough. The drive to Judge Brooks's house took 40 minutes. Marcus sat in the passenger seat of her car, staring out the window at the passing scenery. The city gave way to suburbs, and the suburbs gave way to rolling hills, dotted with oak trees and horse pastures. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost alien to him, like a postcard from a life he'd never lived. Judge Brooks, Eleanor, she'd insisted he call her Eleanor, drove in silence, occasionally glancing over at him, as if to make sure he was still real, still there. She'd called her mother from the courthouse, her voice shaking as she explained what had happened. Her mother had cried, Eleanor had cried, and now, as they pulled into the long driveway that led to a sprawling ranch-style house surrounded by gardens, Eleanor felt a sense of rightness that she hadn't experienced in years. The guest house was a small cottage at the back of the property, separated from the main house by a grove of lemon trees. It had white siding and blue shutters and a front porch with a rocking chair. Eleanor unlocked the door and stepped inside, flipping on the lights. It was simple but comfortable. A living room with a couch and a television. A small kitchen with a table and 2 chairs. A bedroom with a double bed and a dresser. A bathroom with a shower and clean towels folded on the counter. Marcus stood in the doorway, unable to move. He couldn't remember the last time he'd been inside a place that felt like a home. Years, maybe. A decade. The VA shelters didn't count. The missions didn't count. The park benches and the alleys and the underpasses definitely didn't count. It's not much, Eleanor said, suddenly self-conscious. But it's yours. There's food in the fridge. Clean clothes in the dresser. They were my late husband's, but I think they'll fit. And tomorrow we'll figure out the rest. Doctor's appointments. VA benefits. Whatever you need. Marcus turned to her, his eyes shining. Why are you doing this? Eleanor smiled, and for the first time that day, it reached her eyes. Because you brought my father home, and because it's the right thing to do. She left him then, walking back through the lemon grove to the main house. Her mother was waiting on the porch, leaning on her walker, her face alight with anticipation. Is it really him? She asked, her voice trembling. It's really him, Mum. Her mother closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of thanks. Then she looked at Eleanor with an expression of fierce determination. I want to meet him. Tomorrow. I need to thank him. You will, Eleanor promised. You will. That night, Marcus Sterling slept in a real bed for the first time in 3 years. He showered until the water ran cold, scrubbing away layers of grime and shame. He ate a sandwich from the fridge, turkey and cheese on wheat bread, and it tasted like the finest meal he'd ever had. And when he finally lay down on the clean sheets and pulled the blanket up to his chin, he cried, not from sadness, but from relief, from gratitude, from the overwhelming realization that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as lost as he'd thought. In the main house, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring at the yellow, sticky note that Raymond had given her. She'd brought it home, unable to let it go. He carried your father's body through 3 miles of jungle for 3 days to bring him home. I was there. I saw it. This man is a hero. She thought about her father, the man she barely remembered, but had spent her whole life trying to honor. She thought about Marcus, the man who'd carried him through hell, and she thought about the strange, beautiful symmetry of it all, how a single act of courage 50 years ago had led to this moment, this chance to repay a debt that could never truly be repaid. She folded the note carefully and tucked it into her wallet, next to the photograph of her father in his uniform. Tomorrow, she would introduce Marcus to her mother. Tomorrow, they would start the long, difficult process of rebuilding a life that had been shattered by war and time and neglect. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, Eleanor Brooks felt like she'd done something that mattered. She'd brought a hero home. The next morning, Marcus woke to sunlight streaming through the bedroom window. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. Then the memories came flooding back. The courtroom, the note, Eleanor's tears, the drive to the house. He sat up slowly, his body aching in the way it always did, and looked around the room. It was real. It wasn't a dream. He got out of bed and walked to the bathroom, catching sight of himself in the mirror. He looked old, worn, but there was something different in his eyes, a spark that hadn't been there yesterday. He showered again, taking his time, and dressed in the clothes Eleanor had left for him. A flannel shirt, jeans, a pair of boots that were only slightly too big. When he looked in the mirror again, he almost didn't recognize himself. There was a knock at the door. Marcus opened it to find Eleanor standing on the porch, holding a tray with coffee and toast. "Good morning," she said, smiling. "I thought you might be hungry." "Thank you." He took the tray, his hands shaking slightly. "You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to." She hesitated, then added, "My mother would like to meet you, if you're up for it." Marcus swallowed hard. "I don't know what to say to her." "You don't have to say anything. Just let her see you. Let her thank you." He nodded slowly. "Okay." They walked together through the lemon grove, the morning air cool and fragrant. The main house was larger than Marcus had realized, with a wraparound porch and flower beds bursting with color. Eleanor led him inside, through a living room filled with family photographs, and out to a sunroom at the back of the house. An old woman sat in a wheelchair by the window, her hands folded in her lap. She was small and frail, her hair white as snow, but her eyes were sharp and bright. When she saw Marcus, she gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "It's you," she whispered. "It's really you." Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, unable to speak. Eleanor gently guided him forward until he was standing in front of the old woman. "Mrs. Brooks," he managed. But she reached out and took his hand, gripping it with surprising strength. "You brought him home," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You brought my Jimmy home. I've prayed for you every day for 50 years, every single day." Marcus sank to his knees beside the wheelchair, his own tears falling freely now. "I'm sorry I couldn't save him," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." "You did save him," she said fiercely. "You saved him from being lost forever. You gave us the chance to say goodbye. You gave us peace. Do you understand? You gave us peace." "Me." She pulled him into an embrace, and Marcus let himself be held, let himself be comforted, let himself believe, for the first time in decades, that maybe he'd done something good, something that mattered. Eleanor stood in the doorway, watching them, her own tears blurring her vision. She thought about her father, about the sacrifice he'd made, about the men who'd served with him, and the bonds they'd forged in the crucible of war. And she thought about Marcus, who'd carried that burden for 50 years, who'd never asked for recognition or reward, who'd simply done what he believed was right. He was a hero, not because of the medals he'd earned or the battles he'd fought, but because of the quiet, relentless courage it took to carry a fallen comrade home. And now, finally, he was home too. The days that followed were unlike anything Marcus had experienced in decades. He woke each morning in the guest house, still half expecting to find himself back on a park bench or in a shelter cot. But the soft mattress and clean sheets were always there, solid and real. Eleanor had meant what she said. This was his home now, for as long as he needed it. The first week was the hardest. His body, accustomed to the constant stress of survival on the streets, didn't know how to relax. He'd wake at 3 in the morning, heart pounding, convinced that someone was going to take it all away. He'd walk the perimeter of the property in the darkness, checking the fences and the gates, old military habits resurfacing like muscle memory. But slowly, incrementally, something began to shift. Eleanor had taken a leave of absence from the courthouse, telling her colleagues only that she had a family matter to attend to. She spent her days helping Marcus navigate the labyrinth of VA paperwork, scheduling medical appointments, and filling out applications for benefits he'd never known he was entitled to. She was relentless, fighting through bureaucratic red tape with the same fierce determination she brought to her courtroom. "You earned this," she told him one afternoon as they sat in yet another waiting room at the VA hospital. "You earned every bit of it, and I'm not going to let them deny you what's rightfully yours." Marcus looked at her, this woman who'd been a stranger just days ago, and felt something loosen in his chest. "Why are you doing all this?" he asked quietly. "You've already done more than enough." Eleanor turned to him, her expression serious. "My father died when I was 5 years old. I grew up without him. I never got to know him as a person, only as a memory, a photograph, a story my mother told. But you knew him. You served with him. You were there when he died." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "You're the last living connection I have to him. And beyond that, you're a man who deserves dignity and respect and a chance to heal. So no, I haven't done enough. Not even close." The medical evaluations revealed what Marcus had suspected, but never wanted to confirm. Severe PTSD, chronic depression, liver damage from years of alcohol abuse, arthritis in his knees and back, hearing loss from decades of exposure to gunfire and explosions. The doctors wrote it all down in their charts, their faces carefully neutral, and prescribed medications that Marcus wasn't sure he'd be able to afford. But Eleanor handled that too, working with the VA to ensure his prescriptions were covered, driving him to appointments, sitting with him when the nightmares got too bad. Mrs. Brooks, Margaret, she insisted he call her Margaret, became a fixture in his daily life. She would wheel herself out to the guest house every afternoon, bringing cookies or soup or simply her company. She told him stories about her husband, about the man Marcus had known only as Captain Brooks, the officer who'd led their platoon with quiet competence and unwavering integrity. He talked about his men all the time in his letters, Margaret said one afternoon as they sat on the porch of the guest house, watching the sun dip toward the horizon. "He said you were one of the best soldiers he'd ever served with. Brave, loyal, someone he'd trust with his life." Marcus stared at his hands, weathered and scarred. "I failed him." "No." Margaret's voice was firm. "You honored him. You brought him home when it would have been easier to leave him behind. That's not failure, Marcus. That's love." The word hung in the air between them. Love. It was a concept Marcus had almost forgotten, something that belonged to a different life, a different version of himself. But sitting there with this old woman who'd spent 50 years praying for him, he began to understand that maybe love wasn't something you earned or deserved. Maybe it was something you received, whether you felt worthy of it or not. By the third week, Marcus had begun to establish a routine. He woke at dawn and walked the property, not out of paranoia now, but out of habit and a growing appreciation for the beauty around him. He helped Eleanor with small tasks around the house, fixing a leaky faucet, trimming the hedges, repairing a section of fence that had come loose. It felt good to be useful again, to have a purpose beyond simply surviving another day. Raymond Ortiz, the bailiff who'd recognized him in the courtroom, came to visit on a Saturday afternoon. He pulled up in an old pickup truck, carrying a 6-pack of root beer and a box of photographs. "Thought you might want to see these," Raymond said, settling into one of the porch chairs. I kept them all these years. Figured somebody should remember. The photographs were faded and creased, images of young men in jungle fatigues, their faces lean and serious. Marcus recognized himself immediately. 22 years old, a cigarette dangling from his lips, his eyes already carrying the weight of things he'd seen. And there was Captain Brooks, standing in the center of the group, his hand on Marcus's shoulder. "We were brothers," Raymond said quietly. "All of us. We went through hell together, and we came out the other side. Most of us, anyway." They spent the afternoon trading stories, filling in the gaps of 50 years. Raymond told him about the other men from their unit, who'd made it home, who hadn't, who'd built lives and who'd fallen apart. Marcus listened, absorbing the information like a man who'd been starving for connection and hadn't realized it. "I looked for you," Raymond admitted as the sun began to set. "After I got out, I tried to find you. I wanted to thank you for what you did, but you disappeared. No forwarding address, no contact information. It was like you'd vanished." Marcus nodded slowly. "I didn't want to be found. I thought if I just kept moving, kept my head down, I could outrun what was in my head. But you can't outrun yourself." "No," Raymond agreed, "you can't. But you can stop running. You can stand still and let people help you. That's what you're doing now." It was the truth, Marcus realized. For the first time in decades, he'd stopped running. One evening, about a month after he'd moved into the guest house, Eleanor invited him to dinner in the main house. It was just the three of them, Eleanor, Margaret, and Marcus, sitting around a table laden with roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. It was simple food, the kind Marcus remembered from his childhood, before the war, before everything fell apart. "I have something I want to discuss with you," Eleanor said as they ate. "I've been thinking about your situation, and I have a proposal." Marcus set down his fork, suddenly nervous. "Okay, I want you to stay here, permanently, not as a guest, but as part of the family. The guest house is yours. I'll help you get your VA benefits sorted out so you have income. And in exchange, if you're willing, I'd like you to help me with the property. Maintenance, repairs, that sort of thing. Nothing strenuous. Just whatever you're comfortable with." Marcus stared at her, unable to process what he was hearing. "You want me to stay?" "Yes." Eleanor's voice was steady, certain. "You brought my father home 50 years ago. Now, I'm asking you to make this your home. Not out of obligation or charity, but because you belong here. Because we want you here." Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. "Please say yes, Marcus. You've been alone for too long." Marcus felt tears prick his eyes. He looked around the table at these two women who'd taken him in, who'd shown him kindness he didn't deserve, who'd given him a reason to keep living. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he allowed himself to hope. "Yes," he said, his voice rough. "Yes, I'll stay." Eleanor smiled and Margaret squeezed his hand, and Marcus felt something inside him that had been broken for decades begin, slowly, to mend. The months that followed were a process of rebuilding. Marcus attended therapy sessions at the VA, working through trauma he'd buried for half a century. It was brutal, exhausting work, dredging up memories he'd spent his life trying to forget. But Eleanor was there, driving him to appointments, sitting in the waiting room, reminding him that he wasn't alone. He started attending a support group for veterans, a weekly meeting held in the basement of a church in town. At first, he sat in the back and didn't speak, just listened to other men and women share their stories of war and homecoming and the struggle to find peace. But eventually, he found his voice. "My name is Marcus Sterling," he said one evening, standing in front of the group. "I'm a Vietnam veteran, and for a long time, I thought I was dead. Not literally, but inside. I thought the man I used to be had died in the jungle, and what came home was just a shell. But I'm learning that maybe that's not true. Maybe I'm still here. Maybe it's not too late." The room erupted in applause, and Marcus sat down, his face flushed, his heart pounding. It was a small step, but it was a step forward. He reconnected with Raymond, and the two old soldiers became close friends. They'd meet for coffee once a week, trading stories and memories, finding comfort in the shared experience of men who'd seen the worst of humanity and survived. Raymond introduced him to other veterans from their unit, men Marcus hadn't seen in 50 years, and slowly, painstakingly, he began to rebuild the connections he'd severed so long ago. Eleanor watched all of this with a sense of profound satisfaction. She'd spent her career dispensing justice from behind a bench, but this, helping Marcus find his way back to himself, felt like the most important thing she'd ever done. One afternoon, about 6 months after Marcus had moved in, Margaret asked him to come to the main house. She was sitting in the sunroom, a photo album open on her lap. "I want to show you something," she said, patting the seat beside her. Marcus sat down, and Margaret turned the pages of the album, revealing photographs of her life with Captain Brooks, their wedding day, the birth of their daughter, family vacations and holiday gatherings, and then, near the end of the album, a photograph of the captain in his dress uniform, standing tall and proud. "This was taken a week before he deployed," Margaret said softly. "He was so excited, so sure he was doing the right thing. He told me he was going to make a difference, that he was going to help people." She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of the photograph. "He did make a difference, and so did you." She closed the album and looked at Marcus with eyes that were bright with tears. "I want you to have this," she said, reaching into a box beside her chair. She pulled out a folded flag, the flag that had draped her husband's coffin, and held it out to him. Marcus recoiled. "I can't take that. That's yours." "It was mine," Margaret said gently. "But now I'm giving it to you, because you earned it. You brought him home, Marcus. You gave me the chance to say goodbye. This flag represents his sacrifice, but it also represents yours, and I want you to have it." Marcus took the flag with trembling hands, holding it as if it were made of glass. He pressed it to his chest and wept, great heaving sobs that shook his entire body. Margaret wrapped her arms around him, and they sat there together, two people bound by loss and love and the enduring power of memory. That night, Marcus placed the flag on the dresser in his bedroom, next to a photograph Raymond had given him of their platoon. He stood there for a long time, looking at the faces of the men he'd served with, the men he'd lost, the man he'd been, and he made a promise. He would honor their memory. He would live the life they'd been denied. He would stop running and start living. It was the least he could do. If you believe every life holds a story worth remembering, subscribe to this channel and join our community. A year after Marcus moved into the guest house, Eleanor organized a small ceremony. She invited Raymond and the other surviving members of their unit, along with a handful of local veterans and community members. They gathered in the backyard of the property under the shade of the oak trees, and Eleanor stood before them with a plaque in her hands. "This plaque," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes, "is dedicated to Sergeant Marcus Sterling, a man who exemplified the values of courage, loyalty, and sacrifice. He carried my father home from the jungles of Vietnam, ensuring that our family could say goodbye and find peace. And in doing so, he demonstrated the very best of what it means to be a soldier and a human being." She unveiled the plaque, which bore Marcus's name and a simple inscription. He brought them home. Marcus stood beside her, overwhelmed. The applause was thunderous, and one by one, the veterans came forward to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him that his story mattered. Raymond was the last to approach. He saluted Marcus, a gesture of respect and recognition, and Marcus returned it, his hand steady and sure. "Welcome home, brother," Raymond said. "Thank you," Marcus replied. "Thank you for finding me." That evening, after the guests had left and the sun had set, Marcus sat on the porch of the guest house with Eleanor and Margaret. They didn't speak, just sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Marcus thought about the journey that had brought him here, the war, the decades of wandering, the despair and the addiction, and the nights when he'd been so close to giving up. And he thought about the note that Raymond had written, the note that had changed everything. "He carried your father's body through 3 miles of jungle for 3 days to bring him home. I was there. I saw it. This man is a hero. He'd spent so long believing that he was nothing, that the man he'd been had died in the jungle. But sitting here now, surrounded by people who cared about him, who saw him not as a burden or a failure, but as a person worthy of love and respect, he began to understand that maybe he'd been wrong. Maybe the man he'd been hadn't died. Maybe he'd just been waiting for someone to remind him that he mattered, that his life had value, that he deserved a second chance. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to start over. Eleanor broke the silence, her voice soft. "Do you remember what you said in the courtroom when I asked you why you didn't tell anyone who you were?" Marcus nodded. "I said it didn't matter, that what I did then doesn't change what I am now. And I told you that you were wrong." Eleanor turned to look at him, her eyes shining in the dim light. "But I don't think I explained why. So let me explain now." She leaned forward, her hands clasped together. "What you did in Vietnam, carrying my father home, wasn't just an act of courage. It was an act of love. You loved your brothers enough to risk your life for them, even when they were already gone. And that love didn't disappear when you came home. It didn't vanish when you struggled or when you fell. It was always there, buried under the pain and the trauma, waiting for someone to see it." She reached out and took his hand. "You are not defined by your worst moments, Marcus. You are defined by your best ones. And your best moments, the courage, the loyalty, the love, those are what matter. Those are what make you who you are." Marcus felt tears stream down his face, but he didn't try to wipe them away. He just sat there, holding Eleanor's hand, and let himself feel the weight of her words. Margaret spoke then, her voice frail but firm. "You gave me my husband back, Marcus. You gave me the chance to bury him with honor, to tell him goodbye, to know that he didn't die alone in some God-forsaken jungle. And now, 50 years later, I get to give you something in return. I get to give you a home, a family, a reason to keep going." She smiled, and it was the most beautiful thing Marcus had ever seen. "You brought my Jimmy home, and now you're home too." The three of them sat together under the stars, bound by a thread of connection that stretched across decades and continents, across loss and grief and the enduring power of human compassion. And Marcus Sterling, the man who'd spent so long believing he was beyond redemption, finally allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was worthy of being saved. The seasons changed. Winter gave way to spring, and the property burst into bloom with wildflowers and blossoming trees. Marcus tended the gardens, his hands, once idle and trembling, now steady and purposeful. He fixed the fence, repaired the roof of the main house, and built a small bench under the oak tree where Margaret liked to sit. He was healing, not quickly and not without setbacks, but healing nonetheless. There were still bad days, days when the nightmares were so vivid that he couldn't get out of bed, days when the weight of the past pressed down on him so heavily that he could barely breathe. But on those days, Eleanor was there, Margaret was there, Raymond was there, and slowly he learned to reach out instead of retreating, to ask for help instead of suffering in silence. One afternoon in late spring, Eleanor came to the guest house with an envelope in her hand. "This came for you," she said, handing it to him. Marcus opened it and found a letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs. His benefits had been approved. Full disability, back pay for the years he'd gone without, access to medical care and mental health services. It was more money than he'd seen in decades, more support than he'd ever imagined possible. He looked up at Eleanor, his eyes wide. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," she replied, smiling. "You earned it. Now you can use it to build the life you deserve." And he did. He bought a car. Nothing fancy, just a reliable sedan that would get him where he needed to go. He started volunteering at the VA hospital, visiting other veterans who were struggling, offering them the same compassion and understanding that had been shown to him. He became a mentor, a friend, a living testament to the fact that it was never too late to turn your life around. He reconnected with his daughter, a woman he hadn't seen in 20 years. The reunion was awkward and painful, full of apologies and tears and the weight of lost time. But it was also hopeful. She introduced him to his grandchildren, 2 boys he'd never met, and Marcus felt his heart swell with a love he'd thought he'd lost the capacity to feel. "I'm sorry," he told his daughter, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for everything." She hugged him tightly, her own tears soaking into his shirt. "I'm just glad you're still here, Dad. I'm just glad you came back." Eleanor watched all of this unfold with a sense of quiet pride. She'd set out to repay a debt, to honor the man who'd brought her father home. But in the process, she'd gained something far more valuable. A family member, a friend, a reminder that even the most broken people could be made whole again. One evening, nearly 2 years after Marcus had moved in, the 3 of them sat together on the porch of the main house, watching the sun set over the hills. Margaret was 91 now, her health declining, but her spirit as strong as ever. "I want you to know something," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I've lived a long life. I've seen a lot of things. But this, having you here, Marcus, this has been one of the greatest blessings of my life. You brought my husband home 50 years ago, and now you've brought joy and purpose back into this house. I couldn't have asked for anything more." Marcus reached over and took her hand, his own eyes wet. "Thank you, Margaret, for everything." She smiled. "No, Marcus, thank you." 3 months later, Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep. The funeral was small and dignified, attended by family and friends and veterans who'd come to pay their respects. Eleanor delivered the eulogy, her voice steady despite her grief. "My mother spent her life honoring the memory of my father," she said. "But in her final years, she got to do something even more important. She got to honor the man who brought him home. She got to give Marcus Sterling the love and dignity he deserved. And in doing so, she taught me the most important lesson of all, that it's never too late to show compassion, to offer grace, to make a difference in someone's life." After the service, Marcus stood by Margaret's grave, the folded flag she'd given him clutched in his hands. He thought about the woman who'd prayed for him for 50 years, who'd welcomed him into her home without hesitation, who'd shown him that he was worthy of love. "I'll take care of them," he whispered to the headstone. "I'll take care of Eleanor and the house and everything you built. I promise." And he kept that promise. If this story touched your heart, click like and subscribe to honor those who served. In the years that followed, Marcus became an integral part of Eleanor's life. He was there when she needed help with the house, when she needed someone to talk to, when she needed a reminder that she wasn't alone. He walked her daughter down the aisle at her wedding. He taught her grandchildren how to fish in the pond at the edge of the property. He became the father figure she'd lost so long ago, the living embodiment of her father's legacy. And Eleanor, in turn, gave him the family he'd thought he'd lost forever. On the 5th anniversary of the day Marcus had stood in her courtroom, Eleanor organized another ceremony. This time, it was just the two of them, standing in front of the plaque that bore his name. "I want you to know something," Eleanor said, turning to face him. "When I sat on that bench 5 years ago, I was tired. I was burned out. I'd stopped seeing people as individuals and started seeing them as cases, as problems to be solved. But you changed that. You reminded me why I became a judge in the first place, to help people, to make a difference, to ensure that justice isn't just about punishment, but about compassion and redemption." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved my father's body 50 years ago, but 5 years ago, you saved me. You reminded me what it means to be human, and I will be grateful for that for the rest of my life." Marcus didn't know what to say. He just pulled her into a hug, and they stood there together, two people who'd been brought together by fate and bound together by love. As the sun set over the property, casting long shadows across the grass, Marcus thought about the journey that had brought him here. The war, the decades of pain and loss, the moment in the courtroom when everything had changed. He thought about the note that Raymond had written, the note that had set everything in motion. "He carried your father's body through 3 miles of jungle for 3 days to bring him home. I was there. I saw it. This man is a hero." For so long, Marcus had rejected that word. Hero. It felt too big, too grand, too far removed from the broken man he'd become. But standing here now, surrounded by the life he'd rebuilt, he began to understand that heroism wasn't about being perfect or invincible. It was about showing up, even when it was hard. It was about carrying the weight, even when you wanted to put it down. It was about choosing to keep going, even when every part of you wanted to quit. He'd carried Captain Brooks through the jungle because it was the right thing to do. And 50 years later, Eleanor and Margaret had carried him out of the darkness for the same reason. That was what heroism looked like. Not grand gestures or dramatic rescues, but quiet acts of love and compassion that changed lives in ways that could never be measured. Marcus looked out over the property, at the house and the gardens and the lemon grove, and he felt a sense of peace that he'd never thought possible. He was home, not just in the physical sense, but in the deepest, most profound way. He was home in his heart, in his soul, in the knowledge that he was loved and valued, and that his life had meaning. He thought about the men he'd served with, the men who hadn't made it home, and he made a silent vow to live the life they'd been denied, to honor their memory by being the best version of himself he could be. It was the least he could do. It was everything. Years passed. Marcus grew older, his hair turning completely white, his body slowing down. But his spirit remained strong, buoyed by the love of the family he'd found and the purpose he'd rediscovered. He continued to volunteer at the VA, mentoring younger veterans, sharing his story, offering hope to those who felt hopeless. He became a fixture in the community, known not as the homeless man who'd been arrested for loitering, but as the decorated veteran who'd turned his life around, who'd proven that it was never too late for redemption. Eleanor eventually retired from the bench, but she never stopped fighting for justice. She started a non-profit organization dedicated to helping homeless veterans, using her legal expertise and her connections to navigate the bureaucratic maze of the VA system. And Marcus was there every step of the way, offering his insight and his experience, helping other men and women find their way home. One evening, as Marcus sat on the porch of the guest house, watching the sun set over the hills, Raymond came to visit. He was 85 now, moving slowly but still sharp as ever. "I've been thinking," Raymond said, settling into the chair beside Marcus, "about that day in the courtroom, about the note I wrote." Marcus nodded. "I think about it all the time. I almost didn't write it," Raymond admitted. "I almost just let it go, figured it wasn't my place to interfere. But something told me I had to. Something told me that if I didn't speak up, I'd regret it for the rest of my life." He turned to Marcus, his eyes serious. "I'm glad I did. I'm glad I gave you a chance. Because look at what you've done with it. Look at the lives you've touched, the people you've helped. You've made a difference, Marcus, a real difference." Marcus felt tears prick his eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you, without Eleanor, without all of you." "Maybe," Raymond said, "but you're the one who did the work. You're the one who chose to keep going, and that's what matters." They sat in silence for a while, two old soldiers watching the sun dip below the horizon, grateful for the time they'd been given and the bonds they'd forged. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Marcus thought about the journey that had brought him here, the pain and the loss, and the years of wandering. The moment in the courtroom when everything had changed, the family he'd found, and the life he'd rebuilt. And he thought about the simple truth that had sustained him through it all. It was never too late to come home. On a crisp autumn morning, nearly a decade after Marcus had moved into the guest house, Eleanor found him sitting under the oak tree, the folded flag in his lap. He was staring out over the property, a small smile on his face. "You okay?" she asked, sitting down beside him. "Yeah," he said softly. "I was just thinking about your dad, about that day in the jungle. I've spent so much of my life running from that memory, trying to forget. But sitting here now, I realize that it wasn't just about bringing him home. It was about honoring the bond we had, the brotherhood we shared. It was about refusing to leave a man behind, no matter the cost." He turned to Eleanor, his eyes bright. "Your father was a good man, a great man, and I'm honored that I got to serve with him. I'm honored that I got to bring him home. And I'm honored that I got to know you and your mother, that I got to be a part of this family." Eleanor reached over and took his hand. "We're the ones who are honored, Marcus. You gave us a gift we could never repay. You gave us closure. You gave us peace. And you gave us you." They sat together under the oak tree, the autumn leaves falling around them like golden rain, and Marcus felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. He'd spent so long believing that his life was over, that he was beyond saving. But he'd been wrong. His life hadn't ended in the jungles of Vietnam. It had just been waiting for the right moment, the right people, the right chance to begin again. And now, surrounded by love and purpose and the quiet beauty of a life well lived, Marcus Sterling finally understood the truth. He wasn't just a survivor. He was a man who'd been given a second chance, and he'd made the most of it. If you believe every life holds a story worth remembering, subscribe to this channel and join our community. Marcus lived to be 87 years old. He spent his final years in the guest house, surrounded by the family he'd found and the memories he'd made. When he passed away peacefully in his sleep, Eleanor was by his side holding his hand, whispering words of gratitude and love. The funeral was held under the oak tree, the same tree where he'd sat so many times, reflecting on his journey. Veterans from across the state came to pay their respects, along with the men and women he'd mentored. the lives he'd touched, the people he'd helped. Eleanor delivered the eulogy, her voice steady despite her grief. "Marcus Sterling was a hero," she said, "not because of the medals he earned or the battles he fought, but because of the quiet, relentless courage it took to keep going when everything in him wanted to give up. He carried my father home from the jungles of Vietnam, and in doing so, he gave our family a gift we could never repay. But more than that, he showed us what it means to be human, to love, to sacrifice, to endure." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces before her. Marcus spent years believing he was worthless, that his life didn't matter. But he was wrong. His life mattered more than he could ever know, and the legacy he leaves behind, the lives he touched, the hope he inspired, the love he shared, that legacy will endure long after we're all gone. As the service concluded, a bugler played taps, the mournful notes echoing across the hills. And as the final note faded into silence, Eleanor looked up at the sky and whispered a prayer of thanks for the man who'd brought her father home, for the family they'd built together, for the love that had sustained them through it all. Marcus Sterling was laid to rest beside Margaret, the flag she'd given him draped over his coffin, and on his headstone, Eleanor had inscribed a simple epitaph: "He brought them home, and in the end, he found his way home too." Years later, Eleanor would sit under the oak tree with her grandchildren, telling them the story of Marcus Sterling, the homeless veteran who'd stood in her courtroom, the man who'd carried her father through the jungle, the hero who'd proven that it was never too late for redemption. And she would tell them the most important lesson she'd learned from him, that every life holds a story worth remembering, that every person deserves dignity and compassion, that the smallest act of kindness can change a life forever, and that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones we almost overlook, the ones who carry their burdens in silence, who endure unimaginable pain, who keep going even when the world has given up on them. Marcus Sterling was one of those heroes, and his story would never be forgotten.